The phone vibrated once on the kitchen counter, sharp and brief, like it already knew it didn't need to repeat itself. I remember the exact sound because the house was quiet in that particular way. It only gets late at night, when even the walls seem to be listening. I wiped my hands on a dish towel before picking it up. Not because I was nervous, but because I still believed it would be something ordinary. A question. A photo. Maybe a detail about the wedding I was supposed to attend in a few weeks. Instead, it was one sentence. Don't come to my wedding. My wife doesn't want to see you. I read it once, then again, then a third time slower, as if changing the pace might change the meaning. It didn't. There was no explanation, no greeting, no hesitation wrapped around it. Just a clean erasure. I noticed what wasn't there before I noticed what was. No dad. No, we need to talk. No invitation to respond. What surprised me most was not the words, but my body's reaction to them. My chest didn't tighten. My hands didn't shake. I felt something colder settle in something steady and quiet. I didn't reply. I didn't call. I set the phone face down on the counter, poured myself a glass of water, and sat at the table where I'd eaten breakfast with my son for most of his childhood. By the next morning, they would be standing at my door asking questions they hadn't thought to ask before. But that night, all I did was make one decision silently and close something they assumed would always be open. I was 70 years old when that message arrived, an age people like to summarize with a single word, as if it explains everything. Old. As if time alone empties a man of relevance. As if quiet means powerless. I had learned long ago not to argue with assumptions. I simply let them exist while I lived otherwise. I lived alone in the same house I had owned for decades, not because I was stuck in the past, but because it held my life exactly the way I remembered it. Orderly, predictable, earned. My mornings were slow by choice, my evenings quieter than most, and my days filled with routines that didn't require anyone's approval. I didn't feel lonely. I felt complete. That distinction matters more as the years pass. My relationship with my son had always been defined by restraint. I believed in giving him space, in letting him build his own life, without a father constantly hovering in the doorway. I didn't call every day. I didn't ask for updates unless he offered them. When he became an adult, I stepped back, not because I stopped caring, but because I trusted what I had taught him. Or at least I thought I had. The wedding hadn't been a secret, but it hadn't been shared either. I learned about it the way you learn about things you're no longer central to casually and late. A passing comment, a date mentioned without ceremony. I was told it would be small, intimate, just close people. I didn't question what close meant because I never imagined it would exclude me. I had already chosen my suit. Navy simple, the one I wore when the occasion mattered more than appearances. I had set aside a gift not extravagant, but meaningful. Something that said I was proud of him, even if I no longer understood all his choices. I imagined myself sitting quietly in the back, watching him take a step into a life that was no longer mine to shape. I didn't need a role. I only wanted to witness. That text told me I wasn't meant to. What hurt wasn't being told not to come. It was how easily the message was sent. No build-up, no struggle. Just a clean decision delivered as if it required no discussion. As if I were an inconvenience being managed, not a father being addressed. I noticed even then that the words didn't sound like him. My son had never been abrupt with me. Even when we disagreed, he softened his sentences, padded them with explanations. This message had no padding. It had certainty. It had finality. It had someone else's fingerprints all over it. Still, I said nothing. I had learned through years of experience that reacting in the moment rarely reveals the truth. It only feeds whatever is already in motion. Whoever sent that message expected a response. Anger, pleading confusion. Something emotional that could be pointed to later and used as proof of my supposed instability. I wasn't going to provide it. Instead, I did what I always did when something didn't make sense. I sat with it. I let it settle. I asked myself what had changed and when. That night, after the house had gone still again, I walked through each room, turning off lights that didn't need to be on. I paused in the hallway outside the spare bedroom, the one my son used when he visited. It hadn't been used in a while. The bed was neatly made, untouched. I realized then that distance rarely announces itself. It accumulates quietly like dust in corners you stop checking. Back in the kitchen, I turned my phone over but didn't pick it up. There was no apology waiting, no follow-up, just silence. I poured another glass of water and sat down, thinking not about what I felt, but about what I knew. I knew my son. I knew his patterns, his hesitations, the way he avoided conflict rather than cutting people out. I knew he didn't like final statements delivered without conversation. And I knew that someone else had been speaking into his life with a confidence that didn't belong to them yet. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me alert. I had spent most of my life building things that worked quietly in the background. Systems, safeguards, structures meant to function without constant supervision. I believed in preparation, not because I expected betrayal, but because I understood human nature. People change, circumstances shift, and what you don't secure in advance, you often lose in a moment. That night, I reviewed something I hadn't thought about in years. Just one detail. Something small, something practical, something I still had the authority to adjust. I didn't do it out of spite. I did it because the tone of that message told me I was no longer being spoken to as family. I was being managed. By the time I went to bed, the decision was already made. I slept well, not because I wasn't hurt, but because clarity has a way of calming the mind. Pain demands attention. Clarity gives direction. I didn't know then how quickly the consequences would surface. I didn't know how desperate the silence on the other end would become once they realized something had changed. All I knew was that respect once withdrawn rarely returns on its own. And if I was no longer welcome where decisions were being made, I would make one of my own. Quietly, without announcement, the way I always had. I woke up the next morning before the sun the way I always had, long before retirement made schedules optional. The house was still dark, the air cool, untouched by the day. I made coffee and stood at the counter while it brewed, listening to the familiar sounds, the soft click of the machine, the low hum that filled the silence. Everything was the same as it had been the night before. And yet nothing was. The message was still on my phone. I hadn't deleted it. I hadn't reread it either. I didn't need to. Some sentences burn themselves into you the first time. They don't fade overnight. I noticed how calm I felt, and that unsettled me more than anger would have. Anger would have meant surprise. This felt like recognition. Like something I had been circling for months had finally revealed its shape. People who look at me now see a retired man with time on his hands and fewer responsibilities than he used to have. They see slower movements, quieter days. They assume that what isn't visible no longer exists. I've learned not to correct them. Letting people underestimate you is not a weakness. It's a kind of cover. Before I became someone's father, before I became someone's afterthought, I was a man who built things carefully and with intention. I learned early that influence doesn't come from noise. It comes from structure, from knowing how systems fit together and where pressure changes outcomes. Those skills don't vanish with age. They simply stop being advertised. When my son was younger, I was very deliberate about the space I gave him. I never wanted to be the kind of father who hovered, who controlled by proximity or guilt. I believed respect grew in the absence of constant supervision. So I stepped back when he went to college. I stepped back when he moved into his own place. I stepped back when he made choices I didn't fully understand. Each time I told myself it was the right thing to do. We had an unspoken agreement, one I never thought needed to be said aloud. I wouldn't interfere in his life, and he wouldn't mistake my silence for disinterest. I would always be there, just not in the foreground. I believed that was maturity, on both our parts. Looking back, I can see the flaw in that thinking. Silence is only respectful when both sides understand what it means. Otherwise, it becomes a vacancy someone else is all too willing to fill. The first sign that something had shifted didn't come with raised voices or arguments. It came quietly the way most changes do. Shorter calls, longer gaps between them. Conversations that felt slightly rushed, as if time had suddenly become scarce. I noticed it, but I explained it away. New relationship, new priorities. That's what I told myself. There was one evening that keeps replaying in my mind now. I had called to ask a simple question, nothing important, just a detail I needed clarified. He answered, but his tone was different. Careful, measured, as if he were choosing words from a list rather than speaking naturally. When I asked a follow-up, there was a pause. Not the kind that comes from thinking, but the kind that comes from waiting for permission. At the time, I told myself I was imagining things. I laughed it off, made a comment about bad connections, ended the call quickly so he wouldn't feel pressured. I didn't want to be that father, the one who clings when his child pulls away. Now, with the benefit of clarity, I understand what was happening. Power doesn't disappear when you step back. It transfers. And I had stepped back far enough that someone else had stepped forward without resistance. That morning, as I sat at the table with my coffee cooling in front of me, I thought about how often we confuse restraint with irrelevance. I had chosen not to insert myself into my son's decisions because I trusted his judgment. I hadn't realized that trust was being reframed quietly as disengagement. There are things age takes from you. Speed, certainly. The ability to recover quickly from long days. But there are things it sharpens too. Pattern recognition. Patience. The ability to sit with discomfort without reacting. Those are not traits you lose. They are traits you earn. I didn't call my son that morning. I didn't send a message asking for clarification or demanding an explanation. Whatever conversation needed to happen could not begin with me chasing answers. I had spent too many years teaching him to stand on his own, to undermine that now. Instead, I replayed past interactions not to punish myself, but to understand where the narrative had changed. I noticed how decisions were no longer presented as ideas, but as conclusions. How phrases like "we've already decided" had replaced "what do you think?" How my role had shifted from participant to observer without anyone formally acknowledging it. There was something else too, something more subtle. A change in language. In the way my son spoke about boundaries, independence, adulthood. Words that sound healthy on their own, but can be sharpened into tools when used selectively. I had heard those words before, just not from him. The assumption, I realized, was that I no longer had anything to contribute beyond passive approval. That I had no leverage, no authority, no relevance. That I would accept exclusion quietly, because that was what older men did when their usefulness expired. I smiled at that thought, not because it amused me, but because it confirmed what I needed to know. There are roles that don't come with an expiration date. Architect, guardian, steward. Titles you don't announce, but responsibilities you don't abandon either. I had built certain things in my son's life with foresight, not because I wanted control, but because I understood how quickly circumstances could change. Those structures were still there, whether anyone acknowledged them or not. I finished my coffee and washed the mug, placing it upside down on the rack. Ordinary actions have a way of grounding you when everything else feels unsettled. I looked around the kitchen at the marks on the doorway, where my son's height had been measured over the years, at the window where he used to sit and do homework while I cooked dinner. Those memories didn't belong to anyone else. They couldn't be reassigned. What struck me most was not the idea that I had been misjudged, but how confidently that judgment had been made. Someone had decided I was no longer a factor. Someone had spoken for my son with an authority that hadn't been earned. That realization didn't make me defensive. It made me careful. Before the day was over, I would remember a moment I hadn't thought much about at the time. A small interaction, brief and forgettable, involving the woman my son planned to marry. A sentence she had said casually, almost kindly, that hadn't quite fit. It had lingered in my mind for a few seconds before I dismissed it and moved on. Now, with the benefit of what I knew, it returned with clarity. That was the moment I should have paid closer attention. The first time I met her, I remember thinking how put together she seemed. Not warm exactly, but polished. The kind of confidence that doesn't ask permission before entering a room. She shook my hand firmly, held eye contact a second longer than necessary, and smiled in a way that suggested she had already decided who I was to her. I told myself I was being overly observant. After all, she was new to the family. Nerves can look like confidence. Confidence can look like control if you're inclined to see it that way. I wanted to like her. More than that, I wanted my son to be happy. So I chose generosity in my interpretation, the way parents often do when they're afraid of pushing too hard. At first, everything seemed harmless. She asked questions about my work, my retirement, my routine. She listened, nodded, responded with appropriate interest. If there was calculation behind it, I didn't see it then. Or maybe I didn't want to. The first sentence that gave me pause came during a casual conversation over dinner. I had asked my son a simple question about his plans for the following month. Nothing personal, nothing loaded. Before he could answer, she spoke. "We've already decided to keep things flexible," she said, smiling as if she were helping him out. My son hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. "Yeah," he added, it was nothing. Or at least, that's what I told myself. Couples finish each other's sentences all the time, especially new ones. I let it go. I laughed it off. I told myself it was charming. But then it happened again, and again. She corrected him once when he misremembered a family story. She reframed a decision he had described as tentative into something finalized. She used "we" in conversations that hadn't yet involved two people. Each instance was small enough to dismiss on its own. Together they formed a rhythm I couldn't ignore. What unsettled me wasn't her behavior. It was his response to it. He began to pause before speaking as if checking himself. He glanced at her more often, subtly, but consistently. When I asked him questions, his answers felt rehearsed, polished as though they had been agreed upon ahead of time. I felt like a guest in conversations I used to anchor. The moment I realized I was being repositioned came quietly the way these things always do. We were sitting together, the three of us, and she made an offhand remark about how old-fashioned I was. The tone was light, almost playful, but the word lingered. Old-fashioned. As if my values were outdated, my presence a relic. My son laughed. Not comfortably, not easily, but he didn't correct her either. That was the first time I felt publicly diminished. Not attacked, not insulted. Simply moved aside like furniture no longer suited to the room. I said nothing. I told myself confrontation would only harden positions. That challenging her would put my son in the middle, force him to choose sides before he was ready. I believed then that time would reveal things more clearly than arguments ever could. People who need control rarely stop seeking it when they're challenged. They simply hide it better. So I watched. I noticed how she steered conversations away from topics that involved my son's independence. How she framed decisions as shared when they were clearly driven by urgency. How she spoke about starting fresh, about building something new, about leaving the past behind. Words that sound hopeful until you realize they're being used to erase context. My son began to change too. His tone shifted from collaborative to instructive. He explained things to me as if I were the one struggling to keep up. He used phrases like "this is just how it's going to be" without the hesitation he once had when speaking to me. I recognized the language. I had heard it before, just never from him. I wasn't losing arguments. I was losing access. One comment she made stayed with me long after the conversation ended. We were discussing finances in passing, nothing detailed, nothing private. She mentioned how important it was to streamline responsibilities before the wedding. The way she said it suggested a plan already in motion, one that didn't require my input. At the time, it sounded practical, sensible, responsible. But something about the timing bothered me. The urgency, the assumption. I began to understand that she wasn't joining the family. She was reorganizing it. What troubled me most was how invisible the process was to my son, or perhaps how necessary it felt to him. She provided certainty, structure, direction, things that feel comforting when you're standing on the edge of a major life change. Weddings have a way of making people crave decisiveness, even if it comes at a cost. I saw how easily my silence could be reframed as approval, how my restraint could be interpreted as indifference. I had believed stepping back was an act of trust. I hadn't considered how it might be used as evidence that my voice no longer mattered. Still, I said nothing. There is a kind of patience that comes from experience, not fear. I had learned over decades that people reveal their intentions more clearly when they believe they are unopposed. Resistance sharpens strategy. Silence accelerates exposure. I paid closer attention after that. Not with suspicion, but with clarity. I noted the way she redirected plans, the way she framed boundaries, the way she subtly positioned herself as the interpreter of my son's needs. I noticed how decisions were presented as fates accomplis, how discussions were replaced with announcements, and I noticed something else. Whenever I was absent, her influence expanded. When I was present, she softened, moderated, performed. She knew exactly when to apply pressure and when to appear accommodating. That awareness didn't come with anger. It came with resolve. I understood then that this was not about personality clashes or generational differences. It was about control, about who gets to define the terms of family, about whose voice sets the boundaries. By the time I left that evening, I knew I had underestimated how quickly family dynamics could be rewritten when one person decided they had the authority to do so. I also knew that my son was not the architect of that change. He was the structure being built around. As I drove home, the house lights disappearing behind me, one thought settled in with uncomfortable certainty. This was no longer a matter of being patient. It was a matter of paying attention. The first time I realized I was no longer being informed, it wasn't dramatic. There was no argument, no raised voices, no moment I could point to and say that's when it happened. It came quietly wrapped in politeness, delivered as if nothing unusual had occurred. My son mentioned a plan in passing as something already decided. A weekend trip, a change in schedule. He spoke as though I had been part of the conversation from the beginning, even though I hadn't heard a word of it until after everything was settled. I remember nodding, saying something neutral, then sitting with the strange sensation that I had arrived late to a meeting I didn't know had taken place. I told myself it was nothing. People forget details. Couples make plans quickly. Life moves faster when you're building something new. These were reasonable explanations, and I clung to them because the alternative felt heavier. Then it happened again. This time it was a holiday, one that had always followed the same pattern. I assumed without asking that I would be included the way I always had been. I found out only days before that they already had plans. Somewhere else, with other people. The explanation came easily. We're keeping it small this year. The words were gentle. The decision was not. I sat with that for a long time after the call ended. Not because I felt angry, but because I felt something more unsettling. I felt managed. Like someone had decided my presence required justification, approval limitation. Distance, I was told, was healthy. Boundaries were important. They spoke about independence as if it were a new discovery, something that required formal protection. I listened carefully, not to the words themselves, but to how they were used. Independence, I realized, had begun to mean something else entirely. It no longer meant standing on your own. It meant standing without witnesses. When I tried gently to express that I would have appreciated being told earlier, the response surprised me. It wasn't apologetic. It wasn't defensive either. It was instructional. A calm explanation about how things were going to work going forward. About how expectations needed to be adjusted. About how everyone needed to respect the couple's space. The message beneath it was clear. I was being repositioned. I made one small request after that. Nothing unreasonable. I asked to be kept in the loop, even if my involvement was minimal. I didn't demand invitations or opinions. I asked for awareness. The reaction was immediate and disproportionate. I was told carefully that I was putting pressure on them, that my expectations were outdated, that this phase of life required flexibility from everyone involved. The implication was unmistakable. I was the one who needed to adapt. That was the moment I understood that the narrative had already been written and I had not been consulted. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I listened. I asked one or two clarifying questions, then ended the conversation politely. But something shifted inside me that day. Not anger. Awareness. I began to notice patterns instead of moments. The way decisions were delivered instead of discussed. The way information traveled through one voice before reaching me. The way my absence was framed as evidence of respect rather than loss. Each instance on its own was easy to excuse. Together they formed a map. That was when I started keeping notes. Not written ones, mental ones. I paid attention to timing, to language, to who spoke and who nodded. I noticed how often my son deferred, how quickly conclusions were reached, how little room there was for pause. Patterns don't emerge overnight, but once you see them, you can't unsee them. There was a financial detail that caught my attention soon after. It was mentioned casually, almost carelessly, as if it were too minor to matter. A change in how something was being handled. A decision made for convenience framed as efficiency. It contradicted what I knew of my son's habits, his caution, his tendency to ask questions before committing. I said nothing. That detail sat with me quietly alongside everything else. I didn't confront it because I didn't yet understand its place in the larger picture. I had learned through long experience that premature confrontation collapses information. People close ranks when they feel threatened. So I waited. Silence, when used deliberately, has a way of creating pressure without appearing aggressive. It invites movement. It encourages assumptions. It allows those who believe they are unobserved to act more freely. I let them believe nothing had changed. Outwardly, my behavior remained the same. I didn't withdraw completely. I didn't push for inclusion. I responded when contacted, kept my tone neutral, supportive even. I allowed the illusion of stability to persist. Inside, I was watching. There was a conversation one evening that made everything unmistakably clear. My son spoke about the future as if it were already sealed. Not with excitement, but with certainty. He used language that implied permanence decisions beyond reconsideration. When I asked a simple follow-up, he hesitated, then repeated a phrase I had heard before. One she often used. That was the night I understood this wasn't temporary distance. It was structural. I went to bed later than usual, not because I was restless, but because my mind was working through implications. Being phased out is different from being pushed away. It's quieter, more efficient. It leaves fewer marks. I thought about how easily a person can be erased without confrontation. How removal doesn't always require conflict. Sometimes it only requires consensus among the wrong people. By the time I turned off the light, the conclusion had settled firmly in place. I was no longer being left out. I was being replaced. Clarity arrived quietly the way it always does when you stop arguing with what you wish were true. I woke that morning with a steadiness I hadn't felt in weeks. The hurt was still there, but it no longer dictated the shape of my thoughts. Hurt demands attention. Clarity asks for action. I sat at the kitchen table, sunlight stretching across the floor, and thought about the difference between being misunderstood and being deliberately removed. One is painful. The other is instructive. I had crossed from the first into the second without noticing exactly when it happened. But the destination was unmistakable. I took inventory of what I knew and what I didn't. I knew my son had changed. I knew decisions were being filtered, language sharpened, access narrowed. I knew someone else was directing the flow of information. What I didn't know was motive, and I had no intention of guessing. Assumptions are a luxury you can't afford once lines have been crossed. I also knew something else, something people often forget when they mistake age for irrelevance. Not everything in my son's life had been handed over simply because he married. Some responsibilities had been set in place long before the word wedding ever entered the conversation. Not as a leash, as a safeguard. Because the world does not pause its risks when you fall in love. I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't call anyone. I moved through the house, slow and deliberate, letting routine keep me grounded. I made breakfast. I washed the dishes. I stood by the window and watched a neighbor walk his dog, the ordinary rhythms of life continuing as if nothing had changed. That more than anything confirmed that my next move didn't need an audience. There are moments when you can still salvage a conversation. This was not one of them. A warning would have achieved nothing except resistance. An announcement would have invited interference. I had learned long ago that the most effective shifts happen quietly when no one is watching closely enough to object. So I chose a quiet move. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't fueled by anger. It was precise, contained. I adjusted a single permission that had always been mine to adjust. A safeguard that had existed in the background for years unnoticed because it had never been challenged. I didn't remove support. I didn't punish. I simply closed a door that should never have been assumed to be permanently open. I did it without asking permission. Authority that requires constant explanation isn't authority at all. When it was done, I felt no rush of satisfaction, no relief either. Just a sense of alignment, as if something that had been slowly drifting out of place had been set back where it belonged. Boundaries have a way of doing that. They clarify not just what others can do, but what you will no longer tolerate. The rest of the day passed without incident. No calls, no messages, no sudden demands. If anything, the silence deepened. I resisted the urge to interpret it as success or failure. Silence at that stage meant nothing more than that the consequences hadn't yet been discovered. I went about my day as usual. I took a walk. I read for a while. I avoided checking my phone too often, not because I was afraid of what I might see, but because anticipation can turn patience into anxiety if you let it. Waiting is only powerful when you remain detached from the outcome. That evening, just as I was settling into a chair with a book I'd read before something shifted. Not in the room, in the air. My phone vibrated once, then went still again. I didn't pick it up right away. I finished the paragraph I was reading, marked my place, and set the book aside. The alert wasn't emotional. It wasn't accusatory. It was neutral. Informational. The kind of message systems send when something has been attempted that didn't succeed. A brief confirmation that someone had tried to access what I had just secured. Timing matters. So does method. I read it carefully, not for what it said, but for what it implied. Whoever had attempted access hadn't expected resistance. There was urgency in the attempt, a lack of hesitation that didn't match my son's usual caution. He was careful by nature, methodical. This was neither. I felt a tightening then, not in my chest, but behind my eyes. A sharpening of focus. The move had landed, and it hadn't landed where it was supposed to. I didn't respond to the alert. I didn't adjust anything further. One of the hardest lessons I've learned is knowing when to stop acting and start observing. Interference at that moment would have revealed too much. Better to let the pressure do its work. I thought about my son, about how he handled obstacles. He paused. He reconsidered. He sought reassurance. He didn't rush headlong into closed doors. Whoever had just tried to push past a boundary had done so with a confidence that didn't belong to him. That distinction mattered. I spent the next few hours in quiet reflection, not replaying conversations, but examining behavior. Patterns reveal themselves when you stop reacting and start listening. The urgency. The assumption of access. The belief that permission was implied. These were not the habits of someone confused. They were the habits of someone entitled. That night I slept deeply, not because the situation was resolved, but because the fog had lifted. There is a peculiar peace that comes with knowing you are no longer guessing. The following morning brought another alert. Then another, subtle variations, different attempts, each one confirming the same truth. Someone was testing limits, adjusting tactics, searching for a weakness. And each time the system held. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt validated. Not in my suspicions, but in my restraint. At some point my phone rang. I let it go to voicemail. The message, when I listened to it later, was careful, polite, concerned. My son's voice asking if everything was all right. No accusations, no demands, just uncertainty. I didn't call him back right away. That might sound cruel to some people. It wasn't. It was necessary. Responding too quickly would have collapsed the space I needed to understand what was truly happening. I wasn't withholding love. I was protecting clarity. By late afternoon, I was certain of one thing. The attempts had not come from him. They had come through him or around him, but not from him. And that distinction shifted the stakes entirely. This was no longer a misunderstanding between a father and son. It was an intention being revealed through pressure. An intention, once exposed, demands a different kind of response. I made no further moves that day. No calls, no messages, no changes. I let the system remain exactly as it was, knowing that inaction at the right moment can be the most unsettling action of all. As the sun set, I stood by the window again, watching shadows stretch across the yard. I thought about how many times I had been told that stepping back was the mature choice. How often silence had been mistaken for surrender. They were about to learn the difference, because confusion retreats when it meets resistance. But intention only reveals itself when it believes it's running out of time. And now someone was running. The alert came in just after noon, quiet and clinical, the kind of message that doesn't ask how you feel about what it's reporting. I was in the middle of organizing old paperwork, the kind you keep not because you need it, but because throwing it away feels like erasing proof that something once mattered. My phone buzzed once on the desk beside me, and I knew before I picked it up that this one would be different from the others. It wasn't the first attempt. It was the first confirmation. I read the message carefully twice, not because the language was complicated, but because the implications were. Someone had tried again. Different method, different timing, same urgency. Whoever it was, they weren't testing out of curiosity. They were reacting to pressure. I felt no surge of anger, no spike of fear. What I felt instead was something colder and far more useful. Certainty. I knew immediately it wasn't my son. That wasn't instinct. It was experience. I had watched my son navigate obstacles his entire adult life. He approached problems cautiously, sometimes too cautiously. He asked questions. He waited for reassurance. He did not rush toward closed doors hoping they would open if he pushed hard enough. This attempt had been impatient, assumptive. It carried the quiet confidence of someone who believed access was owed, not granted. Someone who had acted before, asking because they didn't believe asking was necessary. That distinction mattered more than anything else. I set the phone down and sat back in my chair, letting the information settle. The pattern was emerging now clearer with each move. The timing of the attempts, the escalation, the subtle changes in approach. None of it suggested confusion. It suggested planning. I thought back to the wedding timeline, how quickly everything had been arranged. The urgency, the pressure to finalize details, the insistence on speed disguised as enthusiasm. At the time, I had attributed it to excitement. Now it felt more like a deadline. People with time don't rush. People running out of it do. I didn't call my son. I didn't confront anyone. Accusations without proof don't uncover truth. They bury it. Whoever was behind this needed room to make mistakes, not warnings that would send them underground. Instead, I did what I had always done when clarity mattered more than comfort. I verified. I reached out to someone I trusted, someone who understood systems and anomalies without emotional attachment. I didn't frame it as a problem. I framed it as a precaution, a request to observe, not intervene, to watch for patterns, not jump to conclusions. The confirmation came back quietly, the way professional assessments often do. Yes, the attempts were real. No, they were not accidental. Yes, they suggested familiarity. No, they did not align with casual curiosity. I thanked them and ended the call. What unsettled me wasn't the confirmation itself. It was how quickly things began to make sense once I stopped trying to protect feelings. The wedding text, the exclusions, the financial detail that hadn't fit, the assumption that I would remain silent indefinitely. Silence had served its purpose. It had allowed intention to surface. Now, it had a new role. I stayed silent not because I was uncertain, but because silence creates a vacuum, and vacuums pull behavior toward them. The next attempt came that evening, then another the following morning. Each one slightly different, each one more revealing. The methods changed, but the urgency didn't. It was the behavior of someone adjusting tactics, not abandoning effort. I began to notice inconsistencies, details that didn't align with my son's routines, locations that didn't match his habits, timing that suggested planning around someone else's schedule. One particular attempt stood out not because it failed, but because of when it happened. It occurred during a window when my son would have been unreachable, busy, distracted, the kind of moment he would never choose to handle something sensitive. That eliminated the last sliver of doubt. This was not his doing. Understanding that didn't absolve him of responsibility, but it clarified the shape of the problem. He was not the driver. He was the road. I thought about how easily trust can be redirected when someone positions themselves as a protector. How quickly concern can be reframed as control. My son had believed he was being supported. He hadn't realized he was being managed. I didn't blame him for that. Vulnerability has a way of disguising itself as partnership. By the third day, the attempt slowed, not stopped, slowed, as if whoever was behind them had begun to sense resistance but hadn't yet accepted it. That pause was important. It meant doubt had entered the equation. Doubt makes people reckless. I adjusted nothing. I changed nothing. I allowed the illusion of possibility to remain intact. The door was closed, but it wasn't visibly locked. From the outside, it might still appear negotiable. That was intentional. I received a message from my son that afternoon. Short, careful, asking if we could talk. I read it once, then set the phone aside. Not out of spite, out of necessity. If I spoke to him, then I would have had to either lie or reveal too much. Neither option served the truth. When I finally responded, it was with restraint. I told him we would talk soon. I didn't explain why not now. I didn't offer reassurance. I didn't accuse. I left the space intact. That space was doing important work. That evening, I reviewed everything again, not for confirmation, but for coherence. The past had begun to reorganize itself around the present. Small moments that once felt insignificant now carried weight. Offhand remarks, urgent decisions. The subtle way my presence had been reframed as interference. I realized then that this wasn't a single move. It was a sequence. And sequences don't begin at the end. They repeat. Which meant this wasn't the first time. That thought settled heavily in my chest, not with anger, but with something closer to resolve. If this pattern had been used before, it would leave traces. People who rely on manipulation rarely reinvent themselves. They refine. I decided then that waiting alone was no longer enough. Observation had served its purpose. The next phase required understanding where this behavior came from, not just where it was going. I didn't need to rush. Time was no longer on her side. As night fell, I stood by the window again, watching the yard disappear into shadow. The house felt the same as it always had, steady and quiet. Inside that calm, something irreversible was unfolding. Patterns always lead somewhere, and now I knew exactly where to look. Once the pattern formed, it refused to stay abstract. It pulled everything into alignment, like iron filings snapping toward a magnet. The rushed wedding, the sudden exclusion, the pressure around access. None of it felt random anymore. It felt rehearsed. Clarity brings relief, but it also brings responsibility. Once you see the shape of something, you can't pretend it's still fog. I knew then that waiting for another mistake wasn't enough. I needed to understand where this began, not just how it was unfolding. I decided to look backward. Not out of suspicion, but out of logic. People rarely invent entirely new strategies under stress. They repeat what once worked, refining the edges, adjusting the timing. If she had done this before, traces would exist. Not gossip, not rumors, records, patterns, gaps. I didn't dig loudly. I didn't ask mutual acquaintances questions that would echo back to her. I moved the way I always had when discretion mattered. Quietly, methodically. I focused on what could be verified, not what could be speculated. The first thing I noticed was a name. It appeared in a context that had nothing to do with my son, which is why it stood out. A professional reference. A connection tied to a financial matter I recognized from years earlier. Not directly. Adjacent. Close enough to feel deliberate. I stared at it longer than I needed to, letting memory do what it does best when given time. I had seen that name before years ago, attached to a situation that ended abruptly and quietly. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it. People move on. Circumstances change. But coincidences lose their innocence when they repeat. I built a timeline next, laying events out not as stories, but as dates. Moves, transitions. Relationships beginning and ending with remarkable efficiency. There were no long gaps, no periods of uncertainty. Each change flowed neatly into the next, as if momentum itself were the goal. What struck me wasn't instability. It was control. She didn't linger in situations that stopped serving her. She exited cleanly before consequences arrived, before questions could settle, before patterns could be noticed by anyone too close to see them clearly. Her story, as she told it, was polished. A series of unfortunate circumstances, bad timing, misunderstandings, always framed with grace, always just believable enough to discourage deeper inspection. The documented version told a quieter truth. Short overlaps between relationships, financial entanglements that dissolved just before scrutiny, geographic moves that coincided with mounting pressure. None of it illegal, none of it obvious. Together, unmistakable. I felt a tightening in my chest, then not from fear, but from recognition. This wasn't chaos. It was choreography. The wedding date suddenly made sense. It wasn't chosen for sentiment. It was chosen for speed. There was a window closing something approaching that couldn't be delayed. Marriage wasn't the goal. It was the shield. The legal and emotional insulation needed before something else collapsed. And I was in the way. That realization didn't come with triumph. It came with a kind of sadness I hadn't expected. Not for myself, but for my son. He believed he was building a future. He didn't realize he was being positioned inside someone else's exit plan. I asked myself then why I hadn't told him already. Why I hadn't laid everything out and forced the conversation to happen. The answer was simple, and it hurt. Partial truth would sound like accusation. And accusation would drive him further into the very arms tightening around him. He would defend her, not because she was right, but because admitting otherwise would fracture his sense of judgment. Pride is a powerful blindfold. I needed proof that didn't require interpretation, facts that stood on their own without my voice attached to them. So I kept silent. I continued observing not just her actions, but my son's reactions. He was beginning to feel it now, the pressure she could no longer fully conceal. He asked more questions, not of me, of her. And each question was met with urgency instead of reassurance. Pressure reveals priorities. I watched as small cracks appeared in her composure. Nothing dramatic, just impatience where there had once been charm, irritation where there had been confidence. When control begins to slip, performance falters. That was when I realized something important. She needed access again. Not eventually. Soon. Whatever deadline she was racing toward hadn't moved. If anything, it had accelerated. And the door I had quietly closed was now the only path left. I considered my options carefully. Confrontation was still the wrong move. Escalation would only push her to take bigger risks faster. What I needed was confirmation. One more action, one more choice that would remove all doubt. So I decided to let the trap close on its own. I adjusted nothing. I didn't reopen the door, but I allowed the outline of it to remain visible. From the outside, it might still look negotiable. From the inside, it was firmly sealed. That distinction matters. People who believe a door might still open will keep pushing it. I made sure she believed that. The next few days were quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that isn't peace but calculation. I resisted the urge to fill it. Silence, when it's intentional, invites mistakes. My son reached out again, asking if we could talk. His messages were cautious now, tinged with confusion. I responded kindly, but without commitment. I told him soon, always soon, never now. That space was doing more work than any conversation could. Then one evening something shifted. Not in my house, but somewhere else. I felt it in the change of rhythm, the sudden reappearance of urgency. An attempt was made. Careful, strategic, different from the others. It confirmed everything. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt resolve settle into place like a final piece clicking into a puzzle. The picture was complete now. She had revealed herself without knowing it. Not through anger or confrontation, but through need. That night, as I sat alone in the living room, the house quiet around me, I thought about how often we confuse kindness with passivity. How easily patience is mistaken for permission. I had given her time, space, silence. Now she was out of it. I knew then that the next move wouldn't come from me. Not directly. The systems I trusted were already in motion. All I had to do was stay exactly where I was. When people realize the door is closing, they don't knock. They push. Direct confrontation would have ruined everything. I knew that with a certainty that settled deep in my bones. If I had called her out, listed what I knew demanded explanations, she would have denied it all with practiced ease. She would have turned to my son, wrapped herself in emotion, and reframed my concerns as paranoia. I would have become the problem, the overbearing father, the obstacle to their happiness. Truth rarely survives when it's introduced too early. So I didn't confront her. I shaped the space around her instead. Outwardly, nothing changed. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't withdraw completely. I answered messages when they came, kept my tone calm, even supportive. I let the appearance of normalcy settle in because people only relax when they believe the storm is past. Inside, however, every boundary was firm. I made one small adjustment, subtle enough to go unnoticed unless you were actively looking for it. A detail left visible. a suggestion of access that wasn't quite gone. It was the kind of thing that would mean nothing to someone without a plan, but everything to someone watching closely. I knew she would notice. People who rely on control are hypersensitive to possibility. They scan for openings the way others scan for danger. I didn't need to signal openly. I just needed to let the outline of an opportunity remain where she could see it. Then I waited. Waiting is harder than acting. Acting gives you the illusion of control. Waiting forces you to trust your judgment. I went about my days with deliberate normalcy. I took walks, I read, I cooked meals I enjoyed. I resisted the urge to check my phone too often, reminding myself that impatience would only distort what I was observing. Days passed without incident. No alerts, no attempts, no sudden urgency. That silence was not reassuring. It was strategic. It told me she was recalculating. Pressure builds quietly at first. The first sign of movement came late one evening. A message arrived from my son, asking a question that felt rehearsed. Casual on the surface, but pointed beneath it. He was testing a boundary without realizing it. I answered honestly, but incompletely. Enough to satisfy him. Not enough to resolve anything. I could hear the confusion in his voice when he called later. He wasn't angry. He wasn't defensive. He was uncertain. That was new. Uncertainty is dangerous in a controlled environment. It spreads. I didn't fill the silence for him. I let it exist. A few days later, the alert came. It wasn't dramatic. No flashing warnings. Just a quiet notification that confirmed exactly what I had expected. An attempt. Cautious, precise. Someone dipping a toe in testing whether the water had changed temperature. She had taken the bait. I felt no rush of satisfaction, just confirmation. When you're waiting for truth, emotion only clouds the signal. I read the details carefully. Timing, method, sequence. It was all there. She hadn't acted impulsively. She had waited, watched, calculated. That told me everything I needed to know about her state of mind. This wasn't panic yet. This was planning under pressure. I did nothing in response. No changes, no reactions. The worst thing you can do when someone reveals their hand is acknowledge it too soon. I let the system remain exactly as it was, neither tightening nor loosening. From her perspective, the door still looked stubborn, but not impossible. That illusion was important. Meanwhile, my son began to notice more things. Not because I told him, but because tension has a way of leaking into conversations, no matter how carefully you try to contain it. He asked questions that weren't accusatory, just confused. Why certain decisions were suddenly urgent. Why timelines kept shifting. Why simple answers came wrapped in irritation. I answered him carefully, always telling the truth, but never the whole truth. I didn't want to become his guide through doubt. I wanted him to arrive there on his own. Pressure accelerates behavior. The next attempt came sooner than I expected. Less cautious, more assertive. It was the move of someone running out of options. The details were different, but the intention was the same. Access, control, resolution before exposure. I sat with that knowledge for a long time, longer than necessary, letting the weight of it settle. This wasn't about money or logistics anymore. It was about timing. She was approaching a deadline she couldn't afford to miss. That night, my son called again. This time, his voice carried strain. He didn't accuse. He didn't demand. He asked whether I trusted her. The question landed heavier than anything else that had happened so far. I told him the truth. I told him I trusted facts. I told him trust is built over time and tested under pressure. I didn't say her name. I didn't need to. Silence did the work for me. He didn't argue. He didn't defend her. He went quiet. That silence was louder than any confrontation could have been. In the days that followed, her composure began to slip. Subtly at first. Shorter tempers, sharper tones. The kind of cracks you only see when you know where to look. She was accelerating now, pushing harder, trying to force outcomes before circumstances closed in. I recognized the pattern immediately. I had seen it before in different contexts, with different people. Calm gives way to urgency. Urgency gives way to recklessness. Control once threatened demands constant reinforcement. I stayed still. There is power in being the one person who doesn't move when everyone else is scrambling. It forces others to reveal themselves in the space you leave behind. Another alert came, then another. Each one less careful than the last, each one more revealing. She was no longer testing, she was pushing. I could feel the moment approaching the point where pressure would spill into confrontation, whether I wanted it or not. The door was no longer just closing, it was almost shut. That was when I realized something else. She wasn't just trying to regain access. She was trying to force a choice. Between my son and me. Between urgency and patience. Between emotion and truth. It was a gamble, and like all gambles made under pressure, it carried the risk of collapse. I prepared myself for what was coming, not by rehearsing arguments or gathering speeches, but by grounding myself in calm. I reminded myself that I didn't need to win anything. I needed to let the truth finish unfolding. As I stood in the kitchen one evening, watching the last light fade from the window, my phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't an alert. It was a message, short, direct, demanding a conversation, now. I read it once, then set the phone down. My hands were steady, my breathing slow. The door was almost closed. When people realize that time is no longer on their side, they stop pretending. They push. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that the next move would no longer be subtle. The message arrived just after dinner, short and stripped of pleasantries. "We need to talk. Tonight." There was no question mark, no suggestion. It was a demand disguised as urgency. I stared at the screen for a long moment, not because I was surprised, but because I had been expecting this exact tone. Pressure had finally crossed the threshold. I didn't respond right away. I cleared the table, rinsed the dishes, and placed them in the rack with the same care I always had. Ordinary movements steady the mind when tension tries to take over. By the time I picked up my phone again, another message had arrived, sharper than the first. "We're coming over." They didn't ask for permission. They didn't wait for confirmation. I opened the door 20 minutes later to find them standing side by side on the porch. My son looked tired, his shoulders slightly hunched, his eyes searching my face for cues he didn't yet understand. She stood straighter, chin-lifted posture composed, as if she had already decided how this conversation would end. She spoke first. "We need to clear something up," she said, stepping inside without waiting to be invited. Her voice was controlled but tight around the edges. "There have been some issues." I closed the door behind them and gestured toward the living room. I didn't argue about the word issues. I didn't correct her framing. I let her set the stage she believed favored her. She didn't waste time. She accused me of interference, of control, of creating unnecessary obstacles during an already stressful time. She spoke smoothly, confidently, as if reciting something practiced. Every sentence was constructed to sound reasonable, concerned, responsible. She said she didn't understand why things had suddenly become complicated, why systems that had always worked were now creating problems. I noticed how often she said I, not we. My son stood beside her silent. When she paused, he shifted his weight, opened his mouth as if to add something, then closed it again. He was caught between loyalty and confusion, and she knew it. I said nothing. That unsettled her more than any argument could have. Silence forces people to fill the space themselves. And she did, elaborating repeating points, sharpening her tone when calm persuasion didn't land. She painted herself as the reasonable party, the one trying to protect their future from unnecessary complications. I listened carefully, not just to what she said, but to how she said it. The urgency, the insistence, the subtle implication that I was outdated, out of touch, a variable that needed managing. When she finally stopped, the room felt heavier. My son looked at me, then really looked at me as if seeing something he hadn't allowed himself to see before. He waited. I asked one question. It wasn't loud. It wasn't emotional. It didn't accuse. I asked her to clarify a specific detail she had mentioned earlier, something factual, something concrete, the kind of question that can only be answered one of two ways. She hesitated. It was brief, but unmistakable. Her eyes flicked to my son, then back to me. The pause stretched just long enough to register. When she answered, her words didn't quite match the certainty she had been projecting moments earlier. I didn't correct her. I didn't point out the inconsistency. I simply nodded and let the silence return. My son noticed. She felt it too. I could see the shift in her posture, the tightening in her jaw. Control, once questioned, demands immediate reinforcement. She moved quickly, then changing tactics. "This is exactly what I mean," she said, her voice rising slightly. "This constant questioning. It's not healthy. We need boundaries." She turned to my son. "You need to decide," she said. "Are we doing this together, or are we letting this keep interfering with our lives?" The ultimatum landed hard, heavier than she intended. She had forced the choice too soon. My son looked between us, his expression torn. He didn't answer right away. The room held its breath. I could see him struggling not just with the decision, but with the realization that he was being asked to make one at all. "I just need some time," he said, finally. "I don't understand everything yet." Her reaction was immediate. "There is no time," she said. "We're running out of it." The words slipped out before she could stop them. I watched the realization cross my son's face. Not clarity yet, but suspicion. Why would they be running out of time? Why now? Why this urgency? She tried to recover, softening her tone, reaching for his arm, reframing her words as concern. But the damage was done. Once urgency reveals itself, it can't be unseen. I still said nothing. Eventually, she gathered her things, her composure fraying at the edges. She told my son they needed to leave, that they would talk later, that this wasn't the place or time. As they stood to go, my son turned to me, his eyes filled with questions he didn't yet know how to ask. I met his gaze calmly, without accusation or reassurance. I wanted him to feel the weight of what had just happened, without my interpretation clouding it. They left without resolution. The door closed behind them, and the house settled into silence again. I stood there for a long moment, listening to their footsteps fade down the walk, then to the car pulling away. I didn't feel relief. I felt certainty. The confrontation had come too early, but it had revealed exactly what I needed. She had overplayed her hand. In her rush to regain control, she had exposed the very thing she was trying to hide. I sat down and let the quiet return. My heart rate was steady, my thoughts clear. There was no need to replay the conversation or rehearse what I might have said differently. Everything had unfolded the way pressure always forces things to unfold. Lines had been crossed. Whatever remained of this situation could no longer be handled privately, emotionally, or informally. The moment she demanded a choice, she turned a family conflict into something else entirely. I reached for my phone, not to call my son, not to respond to her messages, but to take the next step I had been hoping I wouldn't need. The one that didn't allow for arguments or manipulation. Once certain doors close, the law notices. And I was done pretending this was just a misunderstanding. There is a moment when a situation stops being personal and starts becoming procedural. It isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It simply crosses a line and refuses to come back. That night, after they left my house without resolution, I understood we had passed that point. I didn't feel angry. Anger would have meant I was still reacting. What I felt instead was responsibility. The kind that settles on you when you realize that doing nothing is no longer neutral. Silence, which had served me well until then, was no longer enough on its own. I thought about calling my son. I thought about sitting him down and explaining everything I had uncovered, every inconsistency, every pattern. But I knew how that would end. He wasn't ready to hear it from me. Not yet. Coming from his father, it would sound like betrayal of his choices, not protection from someone else's intentions. So I chose a path that didn't require belief. I turned to the law, not because I wanted punishment, but because I needed something neutral. Something that didn't care about feelings, loyalty, or manipulation. The law doesn't get tired of being lied to. It doesn't take sides. It only records what is done and what isn't allowed. There were documents that still carried my name. Safeguards I had put in place years earlier, not because I distrusted my son, but because life has a way of changing people faster than we expect. At the time, those measures had felt almost excessive. Now they felt like foresight. I made an appointment the following morning. The meeting was quiet, professional, devoid of emotion. I laid out timelines, not stories. Dates instead of accusations. Patterns instead of opinions. I didn't use her name more than necessary. I let the facts speak in their own language. The response was measured, but unmistakable. Certain actions, I was told, carried implications beyond family disagreements. Certain attempts, once documented, triggered procedures that could not be undone by apologies or explanations. For the first time in weeks, I felt a kind of relief that surprised me. Not because something terrible was about to happen, but because the weight of decision-making had shifted. I was no longer guessing where the responsibility lay. The first step was not dramatic. It wasn't public. It didn't involve confrontation. It was protective, containment, ensuring that whatever had been attempted could not continue while things were clarified. I authorized it without hesitation. I didn't tell my son. That was the hardest part, but also the most necessary. Protection doesn't always look like inclusion. Sometimes it looks like restraint. He needed space to observe what happened next without my interpretation shaping it. She noticed the change almost immediately. Not because I told her, because systems respond differently when oversight becomes formal. Process is slow. Access narrows. Questions are asked that don't accept charm as an answer. I didn't hear from her directly. Instead, I sensed the shift through absence. Through the sudden quiet where pressure had once been relentless. Through the lack of demands replaced by careful distance. Fear doesn't always look like panic. Sometimes it looks like politeness. My son called me that evening. His voice was tentative, cautious, in a way it hadn't been before. He asked if something had changed. Not what. Just if. I told him yes. I didn't explain further. I didn't justify. I simply said that certain things needed to be handled correctly now. That there were processes involved. That it wasn't about punishment, but protection. He went quiet. That silence felt different from the others. It wasn't defensive. It was processing. The kind of pause that comes when something no longer fits the story you've been telling yourself. Over the next few days, the law did what it always does. Slowly. Methodically. Without drama. Questions were asked. Records reviewed. Doors that had once seemed flexible became solid. I didn't push for outcomes. I didn't request acceleration. I trusted the pace. When systems are allowed to function without interference, they tend to find the truth on their own. Her behavior changed. Where she had once been urgent, she became careful. Where she had once spoken for my son, she now deferred. Messages became shorter, plans more tentative. The certainty that had defined her presence began to erode. That was when I knew she understood the game had changed. She tried once to reach me directly. The message was polite, almost conciliatory. She suggested a misunderstanding, a desire to clear the air. I didn't respond. Engagement at that stage would have been a mistake. Once the law enters the room, personal conversations lose their power. Anything said becomes a potential tool, not a resolution. My son reached out again a few nights later. This time he asked questions, real ones, about timelines, about decisions that no longer made sense, about why things felt so rushed, so tense, so fragile all of a sudden. I answered carefully. I told him only what could be verified. I avoided conclusions. I let him arrive at them himself. That restraint cost me something. Every instinct as a father wants to shield, to explain, to fix. But I knew that if I took that burden from him now, I would also take away his ability to trust his own judgment later. Truth sticks better when you discover it yourself. The process moved forward indifferent to our emotional timeline. It didn't care that there was a wedding planned. It didn't pause for family harmony. It simply followed the trail of actions to their logical end. I thought often during that time about how close I had come to handling everything privately. How tempting it had been to keep this within the family, to absorb the damage quietly, for the sake of peace. That instinct is strong, especially when you've spent a lifetime smoothing things over for others. But peace built on silence is fragile. It collapses the moment pressure returns. One afternoon, as I sat alone in my living room, I realized something else had changed. I was no longer bracing myself for the next crisis. I wasn't anticipating demands or rehearsing responses. The constant vigilance had faded. That's when I understood the real power of involving the law. It doesn't just create consequences. It creates distance. Distance from manipulation. Distance from urgency. Distance from the need to constantly defend your boundaries. The system was watching now. Whatever happened next would not depend on who spoke louder or cried harder. It would depend on what had actually been done. As night fell, I stood by the window once more, looking out at the quiet street. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady, anchored, certain that I had done what needed to be done, even if it cost me something I had hoped to keep. People don't fear the law until they realize it's already paying attention. And by then, it's too late to pretend nothing happened. The quiet that followed was not peaceful, but it was honest. It had weight to it, the kind that settles after something irreversible has been set in motion. There were no calls demanding explanations, no urgent messages insisting on clarity, just space. And in that space, consequences began to breathe on their own. Days passed with an almost unnatural calm. I woke, made coffee, walked the same routes I always had. The world didn't tilt or shatter. It simply continued, indifferent to the private reckoning unfolding beneath its surface. That steadiness reminded me why I had chosen this path. Drama fades. Systems don't. The first crack appeared quietly. A message came through from her, shorter than usual, stripped of certainty. She asked if we could talk, phrased carefully, as if every word had been weighed before it was sent. There was no accusation, no urgency, just a suggestion, a request. It was a sharp contrast to the confidence she had carried into my house days earlier. I didn't respond. Fear doesn't always announce itself with panic. Sometimes it arrives disguised as politeness. Not long after, my son called. His voice sounded different, thinner somehow, as if the ground beneath him had shifted and he was trying to find his footing again. He didn't start with blame or defense. He asked questions, real ones, about timing, about why certain things no longer worked the way they had, about why answers felt harder to come by. I told him the truth, but not the kind that overwhelms. I told him what could be verified. Dates, processes. The fact that when certain lines are crossed, things move beyond personal explanations. I avoided names. I avoided conclusions. I let him hear the gaps for himself. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. That silence wasn't rejection. It was realization. He stopped defending her without announcing that he was doing so. He didn't say he believed me. He didn't say he didn't. He simply stopped filling the space with certainty. For the first time since all of this began, he allowed doubt to exist without immediately smothering it. I could hear the cost of that doubt in his breathing. She tried once more to control the narrative, not with confrontation, but with emotion. A carefully worded message to him, a story reframed, a version of events that positioned her as misunderstood unfairly, pressured hurt by forces beyond her control. The language was familiar now, almost predictable. But it didn't land the way it once had. Because once someone sees the machinery behind a performance, they can't unsee it. The gestures feel exaggerated. The timing feels off. The emotion feels rehearsed. He didn't argue with her. He didn't reassure her either. He listened. And listening, I had learned, was the beginning of the end for manipulation. The consequences arrived without fanfare. No dramatic announcements, no public collapse, just doors that no longer opened. Opportunities that quietly disappeared. Questions that could not be answered away. Processes that continued regardless of emotion. None of it came from me directly. That mattered. I didn't need to push or punish. The system did what it was designed to do. It corrected imbalance. It removed access where access had been abused. It slowed things down until truth had time to surface. Karma doesn't rush. It doesn't need to. My son came over one evening without calling first. He looked older than he had a week ago, not in years, but in awareness. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same one where I had eaten breakfast with him as a child, and stared at the surface for a long time before speaking. "I didn't know," he said finally. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a defense. It was an admission of loss, of trust, of time. I nodded, not because I forgave him in that moment, but because acknowledgement is the first honest step anyone can take. I didn't rush to comfort him. I didn't say it was okay. Some things aren't okay. They just are. We talked carefully about what he had seen, about what he hadn't wanted to see, about how easy it is to mistake certainty for love when you're afraid of standing alone. I didn't lecture. I didn't accuse. I listened. When he left that night, nothing was resolved, but something had shifted. He was no longer defending a story that didn't hold up under its own weight. He was beginning to grieve the version of his life he thought he was building. That grief was his to carry. I couldn't take it from him without taking something else with it. She didn't contact me again after that, not directly. Her presence in his life began to shrink, not because I demanded it, but because the environment she relied on no longer existed. Without urgency, without secrecy, without unquestioned access, there was nothing left for her to anchor herself to. I didn't feel satisfaction watching that happen. I felt something closer to sorrow. Not for her, but for the damage left behind. For the trust that had to be rebuilt slowly, piece by piece, if it could be rebuilt at all. I thought often during that time about the cost of waiting, about how patience is praised until it becomes inconvenient, about how silence can be mistaken for consent and kindness for weakness. I wondered how many people had lost pieces of themselves because they didn't know when to stop absorbing harm quietly. My son tried once to apologize. The words came out halting incomplete. He wanted reassurance. He wanted absolution. I didn't give him either right away. Apologies matter. But they don't erase impact. They don't restore time. They don't undo choices made under pressure. I told him we would talk again. That healing doesn't happen on demand. That trust once bent doesn't snap back into place simply because we wish it would. He accepted that, even though it hurt. As for me, I felt something unexpected begin to settle in the weeks that followed. Not triumph, not relief, a quieter thing. Stability. I no longer checked my phone with anticipation or dread. I no longer braced myself for the next escalation. The constant vigilance had dissolved, replaced by a steadiness I hadn't realized I was missing. Justice doesn't always bring reunion. Sometimes it brings clarity. And clarity, while painful, is far better than living inside a lie you're expected to maintain for the comfort of others. I didn't get an apology that made everything right. But I got something more honest. I got the truth stripped of urgency and manipulation, and with it the space to decide who I would be from here on out. The days after everything settled felt strangely quiet, as if the world had exhaled and decided not to inhale right away. There were no more urgent calls, no messages demanding explanations, no tension humming beneath ordinary conversations. What remained was stillness, and within it the truth of what had been lost and what had been saved. I went back to my routines without ceremony. Morning coffee at the same table, walks at the same hour. The small rituals that remind you who you are when everything else has tried to redefine you. Nothing about my life looked dramatically different from the outside, but inside something fundamental had shifted. I thought a lot about what I had lost. I lost the illusion that love alone protects you from harm. I lost the comfort of believing that patience will always be understood as kindness. And I lost the version of my son I had carried in my mind, the one who would never allow anyone to push me aside without question. Those losses hurt. I didn't pretend they didn't. But I also took inventory of what I hadn't lost. I hadn't lost my dignity. I hadn't lost my clarity. I hadn't lost myself, trying to preserve someone else's peace at my own expense. And that realization mattered more than I expected it to. For a long time I had believed that being a good father meant absorbing discomfort quietly, staying calm, staying silent, making myself smaller so others could feel secure. I see now how easily that turns into self-erasure if you don't know when to stop. An apology did come eventually. Not all at once. Not fully formed. It arrived in pieces hesitant and uneven as my son tried to reconcile who he thought he was with what he had allowed to happen. He said he was sorry for not seeing it sooner. Sorry for not listening. Sorry for the way things were handled. I listened. I accepted the apology for what it was, not what I wished it could be. Words don't rebuild trust on their own. They open the door to doing so if actions follow. I didn't demand promises from him. I didn't set conditions. I told him something he didn't expect. I told him I didn't need him to make me whole again. That was the moment I saw how deeply this had changed both of us. He looked relieved, but also unsettled. Parents aren't supposed to say things like that. We're supposed to forgive, absorb, move on. But forgiveness without boundaries is just permission to repeat the same harm. The boundary I finally drew wasn't dramatic. It wasn't delivered with anger or ultimatums. It was simple and firm. I told him what I would accept in my life going forward and what I wouldn't. I told him respect wasn't optional and silence would no longer be mistaken for agreement. Then I kept that boundary. That was the hardest part. Not setting it, but honoring it consistently. There were moments when old habits tugged at me, when I felt the urge to smooth things over, to make things easier for everyone else. But each time I reminded myself that ease built on self-neglect is a fragile thing. Age has a way of clarifying priorities. At 70, you stop chasing validation from people who have already shown you who they are. You stop confusing longevity with obligation. You begin to understand that power isn't about control. It's about choice. The choice to step away from dynamics that cost you your peace. I didn't explain myself to everyone. I didn't defend my decisions or rewrite the story to make myself look better. I continued my life quietly, letting the truth settle where it needed to settle without my help. The wedding happened without me. I won't pretend that didn't sting. There are moments you imagine being present for your entire life, and missing them leaves a hollow place that doesn't fill easily. But I also knew something else by then. Being present in name only is not the same as being respected. I spent that day the way I spend most days now. Calmly, intentionally. I made a meal I enjoyed. I took a long walk. I allowed myself to feel what I felt without judging it or rushing to fix it. Grief doesn't disappear just because you've made the right choice. It just becomes something you carry with more honesty. I rebuilt my life without explanation, not out of bitterness, but out of self-respect. I stopped waiting for permission to be at peace. I stopped hoping others would understand my silence before I used my voice. And in that space, something unexpected happened. I felt lighter, not because everything was resolved, but because I was no longer living in reaction to someone else's urgency. I was no longer bracing myself for the next manipulation, the next dismissal, the next quiet erasure. I was living my own life again, fully without apology. If there is one truth I would pass on from all of this, it's this. Loving your family does not require you to disappear for them. Respect does not come from endurance, it comes from clarity. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is stop explaining yourself to people who benefit from misunderstanding you. If you're listening to this and parts of it feel uncomfortably familiar, you're not alone. Many of us were taught that silence is strength, that patience will eventually be rewarded, that holding everything together is our responsibility. But strength also means knowing when to stop holding what's hurting you. If this story resonated with you, I'd like to hear from you. Have you ever been quietly pushed aside by someone you loved? Have you ever stayed silent to protect your dignity, even when it cost you something important? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might help someone else feel less alone. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about boundaries, justice, and finding your footing again when the tables are turned, stay here with me. Subscribe to the channel. Take a breath and remember this. It's never too late to choose yourself.